Welcome everybody for our 1245 IROC Investigating Research on Campus. Thank you all for joining us here today for our way to explore our faculty's scholarly pursuits, the research that they're doing, the things that are sustaining their passions, and we get a unique insight into those things. We have one more of these sessions coming up in this semester in just a few weeks, and then our poster session as well. So watch for our YouTube for we are recording today, and that will be archived to our YouTube later. For anybody that's in the room, please mute your phones if you have not already done so. And those of us joining us virtually, please make sure that you are muted, and you can keep your camera off as well. We are recording. If you do have any questions, we'll take those questions at the end. We'll be watching either in the chat or we'll give people an opportunity to ask those questions live as well. Hello. Thank you again for coming and joining us. I'm John Gamera, if you don't know me, Assistant Librarian for Access and Outreach Services, and welcome to IROC. On behalf of myself, our Library Director, Vivian, manning the chat, and Associate Professor of Biology, Evan Markhofer. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, make sure please your phones are silent, and as you're joining the chat, you stay on the mute as well. If you're here for FYE credit, please make sure that you enter into the chat your name, your MSMC ID number, and your MSMC email address so we can get that appropriate credit. And now I'm going to hand things over to Evan. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So I'm really happy to introduce our speaker today. So Dr. von Rosk is Professor of English here at the Mount, and she teaches a range of courses that include American Literature Survey, Forms of Lit, Women Writers, the Jazz Age, Foundation of Literary Studies, and capstone courses in the Arts and Letters division. She has edited a book on the Jazz Age, and she also has numerous publications on Edith Horton, which is the topic of the talk today, as well as other American writers, including Leslie Silko, Willa Cather, Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And these, her writings have appeared in essay collections and journal studies in the Novel Journal of Transnational American Studies, the Journal of the Short Story of English, and a number of other ones. Dr. von Rosk has been studying Edith Horton for quite a long time, since she was a grad student. And during her spring sabbatical in 2020, she had some really grand plans to go visit the archives of Yale's rare book and manuscript library. But unfortunately, as happened to a lot of people, COVID got in the way. But she has been able to continue her scholarship. And she's going to talk to us today about some of the work that she's done about this subject. So if you would like, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. von Rosk.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming and taking the time out of your busy schedules. So I'm so happy to share with you. Oh, sorry. Oh. Okay. Can everybody hear me? All right. So I just wanted to begin with a little bit of background information. Some of you may not be all that familiar with Edith Horton. So I wanted to highlight that she certainly was a trailblazer, and there's a number of firsts here that I think are really important. She was the first woman writer to win the Pulitzer Prize for The Age of Innocence, the first woman to receive an honorary doctorate at Yale, and the first woman to be given a full membership in the Academy of Arts and Letters. So an unlikely trailblazer in many ways. Whoops, this isn't working. Sorry.
Just press this one.
Oh, okay. I've got so many things I need to manage here. Is it working? Okay, I apologize. So I wanted to just give a little bit of background. So as I said, she was a trailblazer, but she came from a very proper, well-established family of old money, who I would say did not encourage her literary talent. They were probably rather frightened of it, actually. But if you've ever heard of the phrase keeping up with the Joneses, and if you ever wondered who are the Joneses, well, the Joneses are Edith Wharton's family. So she was born Edith Newbold Jones. Her family came from Dutch and English roots. They were prominent bankers, merchants, lawyers. And so she had long roots in New York State. Her great-grandfather, Ebenezer Stevens, was actually a Revolutionary War hero. He was at the Boston Tea Party and the Battle of Bunker Hill, and she very much admired him. Her father's cousin was Caroline Schermerhorn, who is the Mrs. Astor, the gatekeeper of high society. There are only 400 people allowed because that was the number that could fit into her ballroom. So the phrase, though, keeping up with the Joneses, so they say, comes from her Aunt Elizabeth Schermerhorn Jones, who built the first and grandest Hudson Valley mansion, which is right across the river in Rhinecliff. And you can see in that black and white picture how grand it was. It's 25 rooms. That's probably from 1853. And then you can see what it looks like now. And you can go over there and have a look. I've done myself. There's gates everywhere and keep out. And sadly, I think it will be demolished. But Wharton called this an expensive but dour specimen of Hudson River Gothic. So the frantic construction of this house is supposedly what caused that phrase, keeping up with the Joneses. And now we can see that this house is Gothic in another sense. It's an eerie ruin, and the roof is caved in and everything's exposed to the elements. Wharton spent much time there as a child. She experienced, and I quote, the effect of terror produced by the house at Rhinecliff. She writes, from the first, I was obscurely conscious of a queer resemblance between the granite exterior of Aunt Elizabeth and the turrets of Rhinecliff. So there's just a little bit of background on her family. And here we have, the books that probably some of you may be familiar with or you've heard of. These are certainly her major novels. And these are the ones that really made her career. And certainly House of Mirth was probably the breakout book for her. And interestingly, during her life, she was enormously popular, not just with the critics, but with the popular audiences. So in 1914, when the war broke out, she really was famous. And she was so famous that she made Henry James quite jealous at times because once they were riding in a car and she made a comment about the car was purchased on the proceeds of her last novel. And James supposedly said that from the proceeds of his novel, he had purchased a small hand cart. And with the profits of the next one, he's continued, I shall have it painted. So interesting to see, their relationship and how things turn out, because after Wharton's death, she sort of falls off the radar and she's not really thought of as highly. She's seen as a disciple of Henry James. And it's not really until the 1970s that feminist scholarship begins to recover her work and her reputation. It also helps that Hollywood also discovers Wharton in the 1990s and the early 2000s, as you can see from some of these posters, Martin Scorsese's visual splendid, The Age of Innocence, and then on the left, Gillian Anderson, as I think of Magnificent Lily Bart in Terence Davies' The House of Mirth. And I would say that to better understand Gilded Age America and the tensions that remain in America regarding class, gender, consumerism, really you could do no better than have Edith Horton as your guide. And some of you may be familiar with Julian Fellowes, the creator of Downton Abbey. He cites Wharton as one of his influences, and he's actually in the process, it got held up with COVID, but he's in the process of doing something for HBO, The Gilded Age, based on her work. Today, however, I want to talk about what is not so well known about Wharton's life and her work. So the great novels are just one part of her legacy. During the war, she produced a remarkable range of writing, journalism, novels, short stories, all the while she was running several war charities and aiding war refugees. So as one of her biographers puts it, she's a resident in France since 1909, and she will watch the unfolding catastrophe of the war and bear witness to the magnitude of the war's impact on the most vulnerable. So I have here on the slides just an overview of some of the work that she produced. It's a range of fiction and nonfiction. Much of it had been dismissed, even by her admirers, as too sentimental, as propaganda. But a critical assessment is now underway, and this writing is now seen as much more complex and more diverse. I'm struck by the remarkable range of this writing. There's much satire, even comedy here, as well as tragedy and moral ambiguity. The stories, as one scholar puts it, are difficult to categorize. So, for example, one of the short stories, Coming Home, deals with a French soldier who returns to his village where all the houses are destroyed except his family home. Well, why is that? And the story explores his response to what's implied that his fiancée has granted sexual favors to the German soldiers to save the family and the family home. Another story, for example, down a little bit further, called Field of Honor, that's actually recently recovered in the Yale archives a few years ago. And it's a story about an unhappily married woman who's liberated when her husband goes off to the war. And scholar Alice Kelly says that it depicts a wartime fear that women were profiting socially, professionally, even sexually from the wartime economy that privileged their lives over men's lives. And so you can also see the Novella de Marne. This was a guidebook that was written to explain French customs to Americans. It was actually put in the Navy's ships' libraries. Fighting France is a collection of the articles she will write for Scribners that I will talk about a little bit later. And so you can see that there's quite a range of work here. So why would so much of this writing done by one of America's most accomplished writers be overlooked and not be given much critical attention? Well, first, let's look at gender and genre. Okay, I think, whoops, sorry. When we think about war writing, we certainly, I think of somebody like Ernest Hemingway or Wilfred Owen. I think women writers rarely come to mind, and most literary discussions of the Great War have ignored Edith Horton, and neither Paul Fussel's The Great War in Modern Memory, nor Samuel Heinz's A War Imagined even mention Wharton. And this is a quote from Heinz. He observes the notion that only those who fought could speak the truth about war is one that soldiers have always had, but it had never been the basis of an aesthetic until the Great War, when for the first time, the soldiers who fought it were also the artists who rendered it. How then could a woman legitimately write about an experience from which she is excluded? So I also think, oh, sorry, I keep moving away from that. I also think that Wharton is excluded because she also doesn't subscribe to the myth of the Great War, which is explained by Fussell and Heinz this way. It can be reduced to two propositions. The first is that the old betray the young, and the second is that the past is remote and useless. And we can see this sensibility in the writing of Ernest Hemingway. He's there on the right-hand side at the bottom and the top as well. And John Dos Passos on the bottom left. That's Wilfred Owen in the top left. So Hemingway writes this: they wrote in the old days that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. But in modern war, there is nothing sweet nor fitting in your dying. You will die like a dog for no good reason. John Dos Passos writes in a letter, war is utter damn nonsense, a vast cancer fed by lies and self-seeking malignity on the part of those who don't do the fighting. So we can see in these passages of these writers disillusionment, alienation, and although the war, as she put it, has shaken all the foundations of reality for her, her writing does not betray this kind of alienation or cynicism. And her work is more of a mix of realism and idealism. And the past is certainly something that Wharton would never totally dismiss. And another reason why I think that she is not included or hadn't been included is that she writes in a more realistic style as opposed to a modernist style. So for many writers, this changed reality brought on by the war demanded a new language. So we see that in the way Hemingway pares down language. Dos Passos, along with Woolf and Faulkner and Joyce, will experiment with stream of consciousness, with point of view, with plot. So at the time, Ezra Pound, rallied the writers and the artists, make it new. Western civilization is a botched civilization. So it seemed like the old stories and the old storytelling techniques no longer worked. And so the fact that Wharton's still writing within the conventions of realism, I think, is another reason why she's not included among those canonical writers on the Great War. So it's interesting to look at her work, A Sun at the Front, and Hemingway's later work, Farewell to Arms, alongside each other within this context. So A Son at the Front is told not from the position of the soldier. It's the father of the soldier. It's the people the soldier has left behind. And the novel was not well received. Wharton was told it was out of date. Nobody wanted to read about the war. But Wharton said she wanted to keep the war alive in people's memories. And as she wrote to her friend, Daisy Chandler, it's a sort of lest we forget, and I'm glad I've done it. Now, the novel went out of print pretty much until 1995. And even since its reprinting, it hasn't received all that much critical attention. So if you go to the MLA database, Modern Language Association, and you type in A Son at the Front, maybe you'll get 15 articles, but if you type in The House of Mirth, you'll get 350 articles. So it still hasn't received all that much attention. Having read it, I would say it's certainly not bitter, cynical, but it's certainly not naive or romantic about the war. It's a deeply conflicted book and a worthwhile addition to the collection of writing that we have about the war. Interestingly, it seems to even pave the way, or at least echo, some of what Hemingway's celebrated novel will say, 6 years later on. So I'm going to read passages from both novels to illustrate what I mean. So this is a passage from A Son at the Front. Two of the characters are discussing the meaning of honor. And this character, Dastry, says, I was considering how the meaning had evaporated out of lots of our old words. Since I've been on the edge of what's going on 50 miles from here, a good many of my own words has lost their meaning, and I'm not prepared to say where honor lies in a case like yours. And then 6 years later, we have the narrator of A Farewell to Arms by Hemingway. This is a very famous passage from the novel, but I think you can hear a bit of an echo here. He says this, I was always embarrassed by the words sacred, glorious, and sacrifice. We had heard them on proclamations that were slapped up by bill posters for a long time. And I had seen nothing sacred, and the things that were glorious had no glory, and the sacrifices were like stockyards at Chicago. Nothing was done with the meat except to bury it. Abstract words such as glory, honor, courage were obscene beside the concrete names of villages, the names of rivers. So it's also interesting to look at the reviews of the novel side by side. So on the left, the reviews of A Son at the Front from 1923. John Macy writes, her story is out of date. Vernon Rasco says, if this were the year 1915 or even 1917, instead of the year 1923, Mrs. Wharton's novel might not seem so profitless an endeavor. One wonders where in the world Mrs. Wharton has been all this time. She's been wholly oblivious to the war-inspired fiction. And on it goes. And then when we look at the reviews for Hemingway's novel in 1929 by Percy Hutchinson, The Hemingway Manor is arresting purely as craftsmanship. Seldom has a literary style so precisely jumped with the time, a moving and beautiful book. Clifton Fadiman writes in The Nation that it's a remarkably beautiful book. It's the very apotheosis of a kind of modernism. So I ask, if Wharton's novel is declared out of date in 1923, why wouldn't Hemingway's novel of 1929 be considered out of date as well? Why were the critics more receptive to Hemingway? And I think we can go back to that deeply held assumption that it was the male writer who had the authority to write about the war, that only the men could speak of the war. And I think also subscribing to a certain attitude towards war, that cynicism and alienation of those lost generation writers. And notice in these reviews that what's stressed is the style, that the style has jumped with the time, the apotheosis of modernism, that Wharton was not experimenting with fiction to the same degree as someone like Hemingway. So her writing style was considered, I guess, part of the past. So I want to give you a more recent review of A Son at the Front, because I think Julie Olin gives a little bit more balanced and a fair evaluation. And she says this, the novel reflects her complex attitude toward the war, suggesting that for her, realism about the war, a comprehension of its terrible conditions, its terrible cost, was not inconsistent with a tempered idealism and a firm belief that the war was necessary. So I want to turn to her nonfiction for a little bit, and the essays that she wrote for Scribner's Magazine. And Barbara Tuchman, the Pulitzer Prize winning historian of the Guns of August, used Wharton's writing here as eyewitness accounts in her own history. And I also want to turn to Tuchman too, because I think she gives us an interesting comparison at the end of the Guns of August for how historians construct narratives. And she writes this: a historian, she writes, discovers that truth is subjective and separate, made up of little bits seen, experienced, and recorded by different people. It is like a design seen through a kaleidoscope. When the cylinder is shaken, the countless colored fragments form a new picture. Yet they are the same fragments that made a different picture a moment earlier. So just thinking about the shaking of that kaleidoscope and that different perspective and the alienation of those lost generation writers, of course, is one picture, but there are other pictures and other stories. So I think this quote is useful for thinking about our literary history as well. So as we move into the war, I guess I just want to set the scene for Wharton in Paris. You know, what the heck was she doing over there? Why is she in Paris? Why France? Well, France was always a second home for Wharton. When she was only 4 years old in 1866, her parents went off to Europe to ride out the inflation of the post-Civil War economy, as many people of that class did. And they stayed until she was 10 years old. So imagine from the ages of 4 to 10, she's in Europe, and that's all she knows. And so she's seeing the great monuments. She's becoming fluent in French, Italian, and German. And like those of her class, as she grows up and becomes an adult, she spends much of the year abroad as well. So what was happening in her life at this time? Well, she's 52 years old, and she's just come out of a very messy divorce. And we have to remember at this time that divorce was something shameful. It was something that people would not do. And certainly her proper upbringing, you know, every fiber of her being went against this, but it got to the point where she felt that she had to for her own survival. She was married to a man who, I guess we would say he had manic depression, and his mental illness begins to spiral out of control. And at one point, he's stealing money from her and setting up mistresses in apartments. And, you know, it was just getting crazy. And eventually she has to make that break, and she gets divorced. So she's divorced. Her parents have also died, and she's also estranged from her brothers. And they basically have swindled her out of her rightful inheritance. So one could say that before the war began, her life had really turned upside down. So she's in France, ready to rebuild her life, start a new chapter, and start work on her new novel. But of course, as is often the case, life had other plans, right? So just another refresher, history, the summer of 1914, as we all remember learning in our history classes of that summer, the end of June, Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Habsburg throne, is assassinated by a Bosnian. And then as the summer moves along, we've got that domino of one country after another declaring war. And Wharton had attended a garden party at the end of June, and she looks back at this moment this summer in her autobiography, A Backward Glance. So she says this: brightly dressed groups gathered at tea tables, blue forget-me-nots edged the shrubberies. The air was full of artistic emotions, and that dust of ideas with which the atmosphere of Paris is always laden sparkled like motes in the sun. As we sat there, a cloud shadow swept over us, abruptly darkening bright flowers and bright dresses. Haven't you heard? The Archduke Ferdinand assassinated at Sarajevo? Where is Sarajevo? A momentary shiver ran through the company, but to most of us, the Archduke was no more than a name. The talk wandered away to the last play, the Louvre's most recent acquisitions. So she also talks about this sense of denial, unreality. In the first essay she writes for Scribner's called The Look of Paris. So she had been in Spain, and she's coming back to the city, and she gives this feeling of not understanding what one is in the middle of. She says, it was sunset when we reached the gates of Paris. The Champs-Élysées sloped downward in a sun-powdered haze to the mist of fountains. and the currents of summer life ebbed and flowed. The next day, the air was thundery with rumors. Nobody believed them. Everybody repeated them. Of course, there couldn't be a war. And we hear this denial echoed in a passage from A Sun at the Front. And I can't really read that top, and I know you can't, but we're internationals. War, whether we want to be or not, the world will never stand for another war. It's too stupidly uneconomic to begin with. Then life's worth too much, and nowadays too many millions of people know it. Think of everything that counts. Art and science going to smash at the nod of some doddering diplomatist. It was different in old times when the best of life for the immense majority was never anything but plague, pestilence, and famine. People are too healthy and well-fed now. They're not going off to die in a ditch to oblige anybody. Well, of course, people do go off to die in a ditch. And what happens is Paris begins to mobilize, and she looks back at this in her autobiography as well, how everything was strange and ominous, unreal, like the yellow glare which precedes a storm. And these were moments I felt as if I had died and waked up in an unknown world. She watched the crowds through the streets, and all were on foot because every cab, taxi, and motor omnibus had disappeared. The War Office had thrown out its dragnet and caught them all in. So Charles Scribner wrote back to her that the response that he had to this essay, The Look of Paris, he's heard more comment on this first article than anything that they had published in a very long time. So as Paris empties of its men, they rush to the front. The hotels, the businesses, the restaurants, everything shuts down. Many women and children are left destitute. So Paris is rising to the challenge, and Edith Horton is rising to the challenge as well. So when she discovers that the local seamstresses in her neighborhood are out of work, she establishes a workroom for dozens of them. And here are some quotes from her talking about this workroom. And she writes to her friend Bernard Berenson, finding that no one had thought of coming to the aid of unemployed work girls, I've opened a workroom where I feed them and pay them £1 a day. The silly idiot women who have turned their drawing rooms into hospitals at great expense and are now making shirts for the wounded are robbing the poor stranded away of their only means of living, and the Red Cross is beginning to be severely criticized for its immense workroom where femmes du monde do the work others ought to have. So I think you can see here in this passage that she could be very prickly and she could be very critical of these other high society women that are trying to help out, but their help isn't always very helpful. And among some of these women, doing good also becomes a competitive way of enhancing one's status. So she really could be impatient with some people, but she felt that these women weren't thinking about the impact of what they were doing and how it's affecting the working women. And she also, we also see in this letter to Royal Tyler, a sense of her emotional state. She said, it's awful to be quiet a minute and think of the crashing ruin all around us. And I'm so glad to be absorbed in the price of sweaters and the cut of flannel shirts. And she looks back from her autobiography and says, we were soon doing a thriving trade in unexpected lines, including men's shirts in the low neck Byronic style. So this workroom eventually becomes self-sustaining. It actually turns a profit, and they become well known for their lingerie. So I've got that picture in the right-hand corner, and she was soon getting orders from America, and it was running very effectively. So as August moves into September, though, the situation in Paris becomes more grim. The Schutzland plan is put into action. And basically this is Germany's plan to win the two-front war. So rather than try and invade France through that hilly wooded German-French border, they would march through Belgium, which was neutral and flat. And that was the plan, that they would beat France first. But the Battle of the Marne takes place, and then we have that stalemate. The German troops are pushed back, halted. And of course, we have this disastrous situation in Belgium as the refugees flee and pour into Paris. So she describes these refugees as these people dazed and slowly moving, men and women with sorted bundles on their backs, shuffling along hesitatingly in their tattered shoes, children dragging at their hands and tired babies pressed against their shoulders, the great army of the refugees. Their faces are unmistakable and unforgettable. The look in their eyes is part of the look of Paris. So because of, refugees in Belgium really begin to overwhelm the French charities. So Wharton establishes another charity, the American Hostels for Refugees, to help deal with the crisis. So as she put it, she begged left and right for beds and blankets, hired linen and cutlery, and within a fortnight, we had opened 2 houses with beds for 100, and a third with a restaurant for 550, and a free clinic. So here you can see by the end of 1914, she not only had her workroom running efficiently for the seamstresses, but the American Hostels was running very well. You can see the statistics here. She assisted 9,229, served 235,000 meals. So she had her hands full, but it seemed to be running smoothly, and she had many good people and friends helping her with this project. And because of her success running the American Hostels, she was actually asked by the Belgian government to care for the homeless Belgian children. And this is the Children of Flanders Rescue Committee. And she writes in the New York Times, out of those awful rooms poured hundreds of little children. Some were picked up in the cellars of wrecked houses. Others were gathered in from abandoned farms, from burning villages, trainload after trainload. When the first detachment started, the Belgian government asked me to receive 60 of them, little girls with the good Flemish sisters in whose care they came. I called on a few friends to help. We were given a vacant house near Paris, and 48 hours later, the 60 pitiful little creatures had come. And you can see here, one of the sisters is conducting a class. She is conducting actually a lace making class. So along with the academics, the nuns were teaching the girls a livelihood. On the right-hand side is the Bell Alliance for tuberculosis patients. So by June 1917, the American Hostels, the Children of Flanders, and the Maison Américaine de Convalescence, they managed 21 houses in Paris and outlying regions. So her good friend Walter Berry says of this time that all the Belgians in Paris are feeding out of Edith's hands. She's half a wreck, but keeps on. This is obviously a lot to manage. And so she did not hesitate on tugging at those heartstrings. So here you can see, she talked about her Belgian appeal to American newspapers, where she said she became a brazen beggar to New York Newport society. And so that high society, of course, becomes a useful web of contacts for her. As one of her biographers observes, it's an irony that the social world she held up to such severe inspection was now the main source of her support for her work in France. And Sherry Benstock writes that she must have taken special pleasure in putting the wealth the Nouveau Riche to such good use. And here you can see how she would write these notes, I have 735 destitute children, my 160 helpless old people, I have now less than 2,000 in the bank, another 10,000 will carry us through. Otherwise, we must close our schools, so please help. And between September and 1914 and December 1915, she raises $82,000, and adjusted for inflation, that's about 2 million. So that's pretty impressive, I would say. And when I was in the New York, before all the libraries closed, I did go to the New York Public Library's rare books and manuscript room, and I was able to read some of Wharton's letters firsthand from this time. And you can see, and you put special gloves on, and it's all very wonderful, and you're in that room, and it felt like almost a sacred moment. So this is a letter to her friend Mildred Bliss, who was a philanthropist and the wife of one of the diplomats over in France. So if you go to the bottom paragraph, she says to Mrs. Bliss here, to have $2,000 fall from the sky at this moment is such a joy and comfort. And then at the top on the right, that second sentence, they are in such a lamentable state. owing to what they have gone through and to the want of good food, that there is tuberculosis in nearly every family. We have had to turn one of our 3 homes entirely into tuberculosis sanatorium. And then at the bottom, we are having the most, and then it continues on, wonderful results. And I'm so proud of the approval of Dr. Biggs, who said it was the most practical sanatorium he had seen in France, that I am hoping very much to be able to keep it up till the end. Thank you with all my heart, dear Mrs. Bliss. So it is amazing to me how much letter writing she did. All those letters are written by hand. And then she comes up with another project to help raise money. And this is the Book of the Homeless. And I was able to look at one of the original editions of this book, which is a collection of artwork and poetry by the celebrated artists of the day. And as she said, I appeal to my friends who write and paint and compose, and to other friends of theirs. So the book gradually built itself up page by page, picture by picture. So the book was designed to be a kind of gift item during the Christmas season. We would call it a coffee table book, I suppose. It got held up a little bit, so it doesn't come out till January, but she does raise about $10,000 with this book. And these are some of the excerpts from the book. There's a score from Igor Stravinsky. There's a John Singer Sargent's Portrait of Henry James, Charles Dana Gibson, The Girl He Left Behind. The right-hand side at the bottom is Leon Bak's painting. He was a designer for the Russian ballet. And so here you get a sense of some of the people who contributed to the Book of the Homeless. So at the top, we have Joseph Conrad, John Singer Sargent, Auguste Renoir. We have Sarah Bernhardt, the actress. Going down to the right, Igor Stravinsky, Eleonora Duse, an Italian actress, William Butler Yeats. And there we have her friend, Teddy Roosevelt, another trailblazer from the same neighborhood as Old New York as Edith Horton. And she had asked Teddy Roosevelt to write the introduction. And that actually was very controversial with her publishers, because her publishers felt that Roosevelt was such a fierce critic of American neutrality. And Scribner's was worried that this would give the book a very controversial character. So she digs in her heels, though. She insists on Teddy Roosevelt giving that introduction. And Charles Scribner, gives in and says, okay. And he says, I regret Colonel Roosevelt's reference to our national shortcomings, but you think it all right. And what can I do at this last hour? And that book is published. And as I said, it raises $10,000. Later on in the century, I'm having a little trouble with. Later on in the century, some of us may be old enough to remember when another group of artists and celebrities came together to raise money for a good cause. Some of us may remember Live Aid back in the 80s. So in addition to raising money for her charities, Wharton also wanted to raise American consciousness. So I want to turn to the writing and the trips that she made to the front. So she had this opportunity when the French Red Cross asked her to deliver supplies and to report on the needs of the military hospitals. So she takes these trips with Walter Berry, and she writes up her observations, and that's those articles for Scribner's. And A. Scott Berg says that her access to the front allowed her to become a reporter, and that perhaps she was the most unlikely correspondent to cover the war at this time. And I want to give you a little map here so you can get an idea of where she went. So she visited the Argonne, the Verdun, down over in this region. And then she's at the Vos in May, and she's back up in Belgium in June. And then she goes back down again to Alsace in August. So, these trips required stamina. There were many long hikes. She's riding mules. She's, going through tunnels. There are lots of hills. And yes, traveling was definitely not first class here. And so in a letter to Henry James, she also reveals that she was close to the fighting at one point. She could see the white puffs and scarlet flashes, the springing up all over the dark hillside. And she must have been an astounding figure on the front. Just think about it, a middle-aged woman wearing fashionable hats and dresses, zipping around a war zone in a chauffeured Mercedes. And she was concerned about that. She didn't want soldiers to think of her as a war tourist. And she said, nothing seemed ghastlier and more idiotic than doing hospitals en touriste like museums. And at the time, she would satirize women who showed up, and I quote from her, tragic and ineffectual, and got in everyone's way. So I want to read some excerpts of her trip to the front. The New York Times described her writing style as carved ivory. The Bookman praised her seeing eye. And she writes of going eastward, one begins to feel the change, chiefly by the curious absence of life in the villages. Now and then a lonely plowman and his team stood out against the sky, but many of the fields were fallow and most of the doorways empty. At every bridge and railway crossing, a sentinel with lifted rifle stopped the motor and examined our papers. Much of Fighting France, these essays for Scribners, describe the ordeals of civilians, the elderly, the children, and the women left behind, and the nuns and priests who are doing their best to care for the community. And she'll often linger on descriptions of buildings and churches, highlighting the connections people have to the past, to people's history, to their memory. So some of her most vivid impressions, I think, are when she visits the churches. Many of the churches have been converted into hospitals and shelters. Here's a picture of one taken in 1918. And so this is now a hospital, and she writes, down the nave stood rows of wooden cots with brown blankets, and everyone lay a soldier, the great numbers stricken with fever, frostbite, or some other trench sickness. One or two heads turned as we entered, but for the most part, the men did not move. And one of my favorite characters that she writes about in these essays is Sister Teresia, who is at this monastery, Pont-à-Mousson. And this monastery, of course, has been disfigured from the fighting. It's in terrible condition. Yet in this precarious shelter, Sister Teresia has gathered a miscellaneous flock of soldiers wounded in the trenches, civilians shattered by the bombardment. Sister seems in no wise disconcerted by the fact that shells continually play over her roof. The building is immense, and when one wing is damaged, she picks up her protégés and tots them off bed and baggage to another. Je promène mes malades, she says calmly, as if boasting of the varied accommodation of an ultra-modern hospital. Now, according to her biographer, Hermione Lee, one of the key moments of the war comes for Wharton when she visits this village in Flanders. She was looking for a convent that was well known for its lace making, and she wanted to bring some patterns back to the refugees in Paris. And so she writes this: at last we came to a convent where there were no nuns left, but where the caretaker told us there were cushions, a great many. He led us through rooms that smelt of linen and lavender. Everything was cold and bare and blank, like a mine from which memory has gone. We came to a class with lines of empty benches, and here on the floor lay rows and rows of lace cushions. On each, a bit of lace had begun, and there they had dropped when nuns and pupils fled. They had not been left in disorder. The rows had been laid out evenly, and that orderly arrest of life seemed sadder than any scene of disarray. It symbolized the senseless paralysis of a whole nation's activities. Here were a house full of women and children, yesterday engaged in useful tasks, and now aimlessly astray over the earth. And in hundreds of such houses, the hand of time had been stopped. The heart of life had ceased to beat. And for Lee, this seemed to capture for her the devastating impact of the war. So on one trip, the French illustrator, Abel Favre, who writes for Le Rire, The Laughter, did a caricature of her and put it on the cover, and his caption, "Ce n'est que ça," is that all? What's the fuss? Is not very flattering. It's rather unkind. It suggests that she's a clueless, privileged woman. And, of course, that was the very image that she was afraid people might think when they saw her, but she was able to take it lightly and she didn't let it bother her. She was the type who rolled up her sleeves and got on with it. And she even had a nice sense of humor about it. She says, he made in a letter to a friend, he made such a good sketch of us. Walter's expression, whenever I suggested visiting a hospital or doing anything good, was caught to a line. So she really could laugh at herself at times, I think. And when she looks back at these moments in her autobiography, you can see that sort of sense of humor and that humility. And she says this of herself, you know, I saw myself, an eager, grotesque figure, bestriding a mule in the long, tight skirts of 1915, and suddenly appearing a prosaic Valkyrie laden with cigarettes. The Valkyrie are the female spirits in Norse mythology who will take the slain warriors to Valhalla, where they'll reside in bliss. So, you know, she's not going to take any soldiers to paradise, but, you know, she'll give them a cigarette. So, you know, she was able to kind of laugh at herself and have a good sense of humor about things. And she looks back at those times, those visits at the front, with a lot of emotion. She's here with Teddy Roosevelt's sons on the right-hand side, Quentin, and just behind Quentin is Archie. And she says, I remembered the emotion of my arrival at the posts I was permitted to visit, the speechless astonishment of officers and men at the sight of a wandering woman, their friendly greetings, the questions, the laughter, the jolly picnic lunches around boards resting on trestles, the reluctant goodbyes, the burden of messages to wives and mothers with which I returned to the rear. And this was a sketch that was done by a French soldier for her, a souvenir. And he's throwing newspapers at her because the soldiers in this battalion had actually their own newspaper that they produced. But she treasured this and kept it. It's preserved in her papers at Yale. And on April 8th, 1916, the French government appointed her the Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. That was the highest honor that the country could bestow on her. And certainly the war took its personal toll on Wharton. She lost friends and relatives, as well as her health. She had a few, heart attacks during this time. And Quentin Roosevelt on the left there, and her cousin, Newbold Rylander, the man on the right, Beau, they were both aviators and they were both shot down. The man in the middle, Ronald Simmons, was a very beloved friend. He worked in intelligence in Marseille and he was assisting with her charities and he died of influenza. She dedicated both the Marne and Son at the Front to him. So she talked about how her heart was so heavy with the losses of all my friends who are mourning or trembling for the loss of sons and husbands. The world is getting to be such a lonely place. And she also loses Henry James at this time too. He has a stroke in 1916. And I have a quote where she writes of losing James. Yes, all my blue distances will be shut out forever when he is gone. His friendship was the pride and honor of my life. But I want to leave you with a more exuberant portrait of Wharton as we come to the end of this. And this is a picture that was taken by a soldier. She's seeing some ambulances off to the front. And her friend Sally Norton's sister wrote of Wharton at this time. She says, with the war, Edith Horton threw herself into refugee work, and a side of her character, which was latent but had little chance for expression, developed rapidly, and her rather starved heart expanded, and she became a warmer personality and a larger human being. One felt it in 1,000 inexpressible ways. Human sympathies were no longer hidden behind a social veneer, and Edith Horton, the critic, the novelist, became the humanitarian. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a few questions.
First off, very great presentation. That was very, very interesting. So I would assume that Edith Horton had some influence in your career. If so, how much?
Well, I started reading her in graduate school. Yes. Oh. I started reading her work when I was a graduate student at the University of New Hampshire. And one of my chapters in my dissertation was on the House of Mirth. And, you know, just sort of one thing led to another that eventually was published. And then when I came to the Mount, I was teaching a course called Foundations of Literary Studies, and I ended up teaching Ethan Frome in that book. So I just kept coming back to her, and she's kind of inexhaustible because she was so productive. It's amazing how much material that she wrote. And this is not really my scholarship, the war project. I'm actually working on some other things. She wrote some Gothic short stories that I've been working on, but she's well known for satirizing the leisure class and the wealthy, but she also wrote quite a lot about poor, struggling people. And so I've been researching her work that isn't well known, like Bunner Sisters, about two struggling sisters who have a shop where they sew and make clothing for rich ladies. And her first short story, Mrs. Manstey's View, which is a little gem, I think, is about a poor widow in a boarding house. And some construction goes on next door. And this is the only thing in her life is the view. But I'm researching urban reform. And I don't know if you're familiar with Jacob Riis and his work in New York City, but the struggles of the poor during the Gilded Age into the Progressive era. So I'm interested in her participation or lack thereof, but you know how she's actually engaged in all these conversations that are going on about cultural transformation and the gap between the classes. So she's inexhaustible. You know, she's got so much to offer and so much to teach anybody, I think. So yeah, I keep coming back to her.
John, do you mind in the microphone?
Oh,
I'm so sorry. We have a question from Michael.
Yes.
I'm going to have him unmute and ask his question. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Nancy. It was a great presentation. I wanted your thoughts because I have skimmed over a bit of Field of Honor. It doesn't, oddly enough, it doesn't describe the kind of charities that Wharton ran. And I'm just curious for your own insights. Why do you think it is that, whether it's A Son at the Front, The Marne, writing a war story, she was very hesitant to sort of give that insider's look into the difficulties that she experienced financing the charities, whether it's the American Hostels, Les Tuberculeux de la Guerre, École Franco-Américaine. Do you think it was just to avoid social hostility, or do you think it was just to make it seem less autobiographical?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think part of so you're asking why she didn't really explore the charity work in her fiction. Is that my thoughts?
Not so much that, because A Son at the Front does deal with the Friends
Right,
of
a little
French art, but it doesn't explore the charities that she herself ran, which is sort of surprising. There's no allegory.
Interesting though, I think what she ends up, one of the things that she wrote during this time is Summer, which is one of my favorite works that she writes. And it's so remote in the setting and the situation. And she talked about writing this at a fever pitch of creative joy, that it has nothing to do with what's going on, that she was dealing with these war scenes and helping people. I think part of it was she had to step away from that. And doing all this war work was really hard on her because she wasn't able to write. She was writing essays and letters, thank you, letters, but she was a novelist and she really needed that outlet. And she talks about writing Summer, about a coming of age of a young woman in rural Massachusetts. And she said, I had never envisioned things so clearly as when I was composing this book. I don't know how it got written with everything else that was going on, but she had this need, I think, to step away from all the hassles and the stress and the chaos of running those charities, that I think that just wasn't for her where she wanted to be, as an artist and in terms of fiction and what makes a good story. But yeah, I also think that there's a sense that it could have been too autobiographical. And she may have just stepped away. But I think she needed to step away from those scenes, and her writing about other things was a way to do that, if that makes any sense.
It does indeed. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And by the way, Michael is an expert on humanitarian work that was done during World War I. So we will have to definitely meet and chat. So it's great to know that somebody on our campus is so well versed in all of this.
Any additional questions?
Hi, I was struck by something you said about Edith Horton's life, the context of where she was in her personal life
Right.
before she did the humanitarian work.
Yeah.
You mentioned she was divorced, she was estranged from family. You didn't mention any children.
No.
So I was wondering if you could speak at all about any literature, feminist literature, or your own thoughts on her position in life that allowed her to do this really amazing humanitarian work without a family that she was expected to support or care for.
Right. Yeah. So she, well, yeah, there's not much, she's never said much about not having children. Some people would say that she and Teddy never even had sex. You know, that the marriage was a disaster, and she does have an affair with someone. That's another story. But so your question was, how does her not having children, or kind of she really was, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just kind of speaking to her social or her position in life,
Right. Yeah.
allowing, you know, most of those
Right.
women in those social positions wouldn't have the flexibility
Right.
to travel and start
Yeah.
shelters, for lack of a better
Right.
word,
Yeah.
for children. So if you could speak at all to how unique of a position she was in as a woman
Yeah.
to offer that at a time when society
Right.
would have maybe frowned upon.
Yes.
divorce.
Yeah. So yeah, she really made the most of her position and the influence that she had, the money that she had, the time that she had, the freedom to travel. So yeah, all of that would have been obviously more difficult if she had children. I think it was an emptiness in her life in one way, but she found, one thing about Wharton is she found family in her friendships, and she had friends that lasted all her life. And she was able to recreate family in other ways. And one of the women that she works with, Elisina Tyler, her child becomes like Wharton's child in a way. So she and her niece, Beatrix Ferrand, who is the first female landscape architect, fabulous. She designed Dumbarton Oaks. You can see on Hyde Park, one of Beatrix's creations, the garden. There's a walled garden there, but her niece was very much a kind of child. She was a mother figure for her, a role model for Beatrix. So that was her brother's child. And she was estranged from her brother, but she stayed friends with Minnie, the brother's wife, all her life. And those three women were like a family for each other. So yeah, she kind of cobbled together. She rewrote it and did it her way. So she didn't have those traditional things that women are expected to have, but she also had other things that, like money, wealth, position, and she used it to make her life better and the lives of other people better as well. So yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks, Nancy. I always enjoy listening to your talks. And my question kind of touches on what Gina was just asking about, which is who worked with Edith in these things? I mean, it's great to raise all this money.
Right.
Then you come back. I mean, there's a lot to be done.
Right.
Is it other women of society?
There are other women. Elisina Tyler is one of them. Mildred Bliss, who I quoted in the letter, she helped out a lot. She had a lot of French workers who were helping her. And when the American Red Cross comes over later on to kind of take over, that causes a bit of drama because they kind of fire the French workers. But she had a whole host of people helping her. And let's not forget, she had servants. She had somebody driving the car. So And she had servants that were like family to her because they were with her. Her governess as well. Minnie becomes a literary agent. That's her sister-in-law. So there's a whole kind of army of people behind her that are working with her and working for her, you know. So there's all these invisible people that make it possible, you know.
So, and it's mainly all women then?
A lot of them are women, yeah.
Or-
But, you know, she's an interesting contradiction because she wasn't very much of a feminist and she could even be kind of anti woman. You know, she thought women were silly sometimes, and many of her closest friends, she had a community of men that she, you know, she had these close male friends. So, you know, what there's someone said, and we're not sure who said it, but you know, Edith Horton and Teddy Roosevelt were both self-made men. You know, is how the story goes. So she kind of had an interesting, you know, identifying with women and then kind of pulling away and enjoying the intellectual camaraderie of these men for much of her life.
I had no idea that she had these, you
Yeah.
know, was in charge of these initiatives during the war, and it certainly is very impressive. And just to think about what it takes to get
Right,
big projects done,
exactly.
it's really quite astonishing,
It is.
all of her accomplishments. So
Right.
thanks.
So, well, I'm glad that I've taught you all about that because I just wanted people to know, you know, there's just, and it's very inspiring, I think, when people come together, the things that can happen. So.
Well, let's thank Dr. Von Rosk again for her.
Thanks so much for coming.